In this lesson, we will configure Spring Security to use our LDAP server for authentication and authorization. To begin, we need to add a new dependency to our pom.xml file. And this dependency is going to contain all of our classes pertaining to setting up an LDAP server. So if you navigate to the pom.xml file and click on the Dependencies tab at the bottom of the editor window, you can then navigate to Add, and we're going to add the Spring Security LDAP artifact, and we'll select the artifact with the org.springframework.security group. So just click on OK, and that will add that dependency to our POM file, and then save our POM. At this point, you can close the POM file because we will no longer be needing it. And configuring the LDAP server is actually made quite simple by Spring Security. This is really the beauty of using the Spring framework within our applications, because there's just a lot of plug and play with our configuration that allows us to easily perform a large amount of work to our application. At the moment, you'll notice that our authentication provider is set up to use a JDBC user service. We are going to swap out that authentication provider, which is actually an instance of a DAO authentication provider, and we're going to use an LDAP authentication provider. So simply remove the authentication provider from the authentication manager, and then within the body of that authentication manager tag, you can select a LDAP authentication provider tag, and that's provided by our security namespace. Now we're going to configure our authentication provider. And the first attribute that you will notice within the authentication provider tag is a server ref. This is a reference to a bean that represents our LDAP server. So I'm just going to name this reference LDAP server, and that means that we need to configure a bean with the ID of LDAP server. Once again, to the rescue, here comes the security namespace. You'll notice the LDAP server tag. We'll go ahead and set up this bean to have an ID of LDAP server. Within this LDAP server tag, probably the most important attribute is the URL attribute, the URL of our LDAP server. It's very similar to a web address. So the first thing we provide is the protocol, and in this case it's LDAP, and then we use a colon, 2 forward slashes, and now we're going to specify basically the domain of this LDAP server. And in our case, it's sitting on the local host, so we're just going to use the server name and then a port. After the server name and the port, we specify the domain controller, and that's actually going to be the DN of our domain controller. So let's navigate over to Apache Directory Studio and take a look at our server so that we can find this information. First, just make sure that your server is started. And then if you double click on your server, you'll get this configuration dialog. And here you'll see that our port is port 10,389. So just copy that over to your config and put the port in, and then navigate to our domain controller. And from here, you can copy the DN. And if we copy and paste all of this, it makes it pretty simple so that we don't have any errors because, we mistype something. Another thing you can do with this LDAP server attribute is you can specify a manager DN as well as a manager password. This is not required, but it allows you to provide credentials that will be used to bind to the LDAP server when we perform our searches. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to set this to the DN of the admin user for the LDAP and the password. Now I'm going to go ahead and tell you that the LDAP admin password is by default secret. So go ahead and type secret in for the manager password. And now we're going to navigate over to the LDAP, and we will find the admin located within the organizational unit system and then the UID admin. So let's go ahead and copy that DN, and we'll take that over to our configuration files. Okay, so at this point, we have our LDAP server configured, and it is specified as a reference on our authentication provider. Now, there's one more thing that we need to specify, and that is an attribute on the authentication provider itself. And the attribute is the user DN pattern. So this is a pattern that will be searched throughout our LDAP to find the user who is attempting to log in. When the credentials are supplied to the LDAP authentication provider, it is going to take the username and pass it into a placeholder we're going to put in the value for this pattern. That placeholder is going to be a curly brace, 0, curly brace. So if we were just to leave it like this, that would just provide the username of a user, and it would go search the LDAP for just that username against the DNs for every entry in the LDAP. It would not find anything. But since we have all of our users within this people organization unit, we can grab the UID of organizational unit people. Now, we don't need to add the domain controller because that will be appended by default, but we can take that, remove the domain controller, and then specify the UID is equal to our placeholder. What we're saying there is we're going to insert whatever username is supplied as the UID, and then we're going to look for comma OU people. You can also just infer that the domain controller is going to be prefixed on to this DN. Let's say we put in our kBowerSox user, it would look like UID is equal to kBowerSox, comma OU is equal to people. And what would happen is Spring Security is going to connect to our LDAP using the administrative credentials, and then it's going to begin to look at each DN. So here we see like our DN is performing a query. And then here it's finally going to get to a DN that matches because we see UID is equal to kBowerSox, comma OU equal to people. And it's going to return that user, and that user's credentials are going to be used for authentication. And then if we authenticate, we will consider their authorities for authorization. So we have our configuration in place. Let's go ahead and save our securitycontext.xml file. Now we'll run through an example and log in using our LDAP server. So all of our authentication will be provided by our LDAP. So I'm just going to restart our server, and I'm going to attempt to sign in. We'll provide the credentials for the kBowerSox user, and the password is password. There we see we're able to log in to the application. And that authentication was performed using our LDAP authentication provider. So this is the basic setup of using an LDAP with Spring Security.